Welcome, friends, to the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we're off, but we'll be releasing a former Patreon exclusive in what we're calling a From the Vault episode. This one is on The Hobbit, the Rankin Bass animated film from 1977.
So these Patreon exclusive episodes are recorded audio only. So for you YouTube fans, if you're wondering why there's no video here, that would be the reason. But, we'll be back next week with more video content. This is on The Hobbit, and we are admittedly pretty massive Lord of the Rings fans and The Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien fans. So it was really fun to get to view this animated version that I had never seen before.
Yeah, and it was a beloved film from my childhood. I remember I got to sort of reminisce about it with you here. We also thought with Bernard Hill's passing recently,
King Theoden
himself, that it would be appropriate to return to Lord of the Rings. I definitely have been watching tributes and seeing a lot of those scenes of him, riding in front of the Rohirrim, and all the speeches he gives in those movies are just so powerful already. And then you take that on top of him passing, and it's just been waterworks over here for sure, man.
Yeah, he's a legend.
Such a great part of those movies, right? He comes out of nowhere. Honestly, the first time I saw it, it's I'm not expecting this Theoden character to be such an iconic one going forward, because when you first meet him, he's got all, he's been ensorcelled, so he looks all like he's old and decrepit and weak, and then all of a sudden he becomes one of the coolest characters. I don't know, it's just such an awesome transformation. It's so well performed.
I also love a character that's not super flashy on that's not the character I loved as a kid, right? I was really in for Gimli and Legolas and Aragorn, and as time has gone on, I really understood his performance and the magnitude of what his character impacts in the story, and he brought so much to that, and some of the most epic lines in the entire trilogy are from him.
Sorely missed. I did want to get in a couple of housekeeping notes here right before we unlock this episode. The Prestige won our rapid fire poll we had up recently against the second Twilight film, so we will be tackling The Prestige next. Really excited for that one. Christopher Nolan is such an icon, so I'd love to talk Christopher Nolan, and that movie in particular should be a lot of fun. I've never read the book, so that'll be our first time doing that.
Yeah, and if you were polling for Twilight New Moon, which was the other option in our poll, definitely keep an eye out, because I have a feeling that we'll see that again in polls in the future. And if you want to get a chance to enter your favorite projects that you'd like to see us cover, or if you'd like to be involved in the voting for some of these, we want to check out our Patreon, which also allows you to hear these episodes, because this episode is the Hobbit episode here that you're about to hear is from 2022. So if you want to hear those as they come out, check out Patreon, and just for $2 you can support us and hear this content.
Yeah, you could hear our episode we just released on the Fallout TV show, which is very timely right now. We're really excited for that one. Just put it out, so we'd love to have you over there. And if you did join us, one of the things you can do on Patreon is participate in our quarterly polls, which is where we have every quarter, every few months, we do a completely community voted project. And the way we do that is we have a master list that people can comment on, and actually anybody, you just have to follow us on Patreon. You don't even have to pay. Just be on Patreon, and you can comment a suggestion. And then the way we do it is we look and see all the comments we go through, and whichever comments have the most votes, the top 4 will become a dedicated poll 1 week before the quarterly project, and that will be how we determine it. So the dates you need to know are get your suggestions in by May 26th, then we'll be creating that 1 week poll, and then we'll be following it up with that quarterly. So you have a few weeks to get them in, but don't sleep on it.
Yeah, we love community voted projects. It's such a fun way to interact with you all and to, hear us react to some of the projects we may not have gotten to or wouldn't have been able to cover as quickly, like Twilight. I know was a big hit with our audience recently.
I continue to have very mixed feelings about it. At the very least, our coverage was popular, and it seemed like people enjoyed it. But we've gone on long now. I think let's go ahead and just leave it for The Hobbit. So enjoy this former Patreon exclusive. This one is covering the 1977 Rankin Bass animated version of The Hobbit. We just watched the animated version of The Hobbit, which, as I've talked about on our main cover several times, was foundational for me. It was my first experience with Lord of the Rings, going all the way back to my childhood. I was probably 3 to 5 years old when I first saw this thing. I was young kid. And I watched it a ton at that age, but watching it this time, I realized like I haven't seen this in a long freaking time. And there's of course parts that I didn't remember, or I like barely remember, or are just completely different context for me now. Like I feel completely differently about them. So it was a very interesting experience revisiting something that was so foundational. But this was also your first time seeing it. So yeah, I'm gonna open up with you. I want you to tell me what your first impression was of this movie.
So this is a bonus episode that's been coming for a long time. We've talked about this, as well as the Hobbit coverage that's going on our main feed right now. We've talked about doing this forever, since, early on in the podcast.
Yeah. Well, because we covered Rankin Bass a couple times, actually, because we covered them for the follow-up Return of the King they did, and then we've also covered them for...
Rudolph.
Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and the Last Unicorn was Rankin Bass. So we've done a lot of Rankin Bass now. And all of the times we've covered them, I feel like we've had kind of a mixed reaction to the animation style. Like at times it looks great. At times we're like, I don't know about this. It looks kind of weird.
We won't get into super deep coverage with Rankin Bass. We've talked about it many times on the main feed as well. So, there's connections to Japanese animation, and they're outsourcing a lot of their...
production studio that went defunct and is now, like a lot of the people who worked there are now with Studio Ghibli.
Right. And so like that, they were outsourcing animation from Japanese animation, and they're also doing in-house animation, I believe. So it's like there's maybe some inconsistency at times, but there are times that it looks great.
Well, and this is also a made-for-TV thing. Like you can tell there's like built-in commercial breaks, and so it's more similar to like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, because that was that same way too.
Yeah, so I mean, just coming in, it's my first time seeing it. I don't have any of the nostalgia for it.
Right.
And you set a high bar with it. I remember many, many times you being like, this is the best adaptation of The Hobbit, potentially. Like, and saying like...
Well, I still think it might be the most faithful.
It might be, yeah. I was expecting to be at a very high level, and I enjoyed myself. I came out being like, it was a fun... definitely geared towards children Hobbit journey.
Very geared towards children. There's a reason it appealed to, very, very young Luke.
Right. And one of the biggest takeaways for me is that if I saw this, I would yearn for a longer version of it. And then it's funny because the longer version that we've got of it now is maybe too long. So the perfect version might be somewhere in the middle and still doesn't exist.
This felt like it went at a breakneck pace. I was like, holy shit, we're flying through this plot, because it's an hour and 15, and, we're covering now 3 movies that take 3 hours apiece. So it's quite different, and because of that, you fly through scenes. But, of course, I didn't have any context. I hadn't even read the book. So for me, this was the story, and I think, as a young kid, it moved on to the next thing quick enough to keep me interested. And I remember I loved the songs. Like, when you're that age, you want, like Disney movies are often very musical for that reason. I think kids latch on to music.
I mean, animation has a history of being musicals for a long, long time.
And so that appealed to me. And I it's funny because even as a kid, I remember like one of my songs I liked the least was The Greatest Adventure.
That one stands out to me, and it's through the whole story. It bothered me. I didn't like that one. I really did.
It's the one I remember as a kid being like, I wish they wouldn't keep coming back to this song. And it's funny because I was in my research, I saw that it was the only original song for the movie. Like everything else is drawn from some sort of song from the text. But that was the only time where they were like, we're just going to write a completely new song and have it be sort of the motif it's going to keep coming back to.
And you could tell when it was from the book. You like whether, like you said, even as a kid, maybe you realize that it just, there's something about it that feels like it's fitting within the story. And then The Greatest Adventure feels like a song that's sort of just saying like, we're on an adventure, enjoy yourselves, isn't this magical? And
it doesn't make any sense, honestly. Like I don't like it. I still don't like it at all. But yeah, what were your thoughts overall on the music though? Did you like the music?
I liked it. Interesting style for some of the songs, not what my imagination was for them, having come from the book first. But yeah, overall I really liked it. Like for example, the Misty Mountain song was a lot. It was differently paced than I ever kind of thought in my mind.
What's funny is in my memory, it sort of blended with the new version we got, and I thought it was a lot closer to that. Like I thought I was like, yeah, it's like the same tune, but then like hearing it now, it's like, yeah, this is definitely pretty different.
But yeah, a lot of them are fun, and you know what I like about them is that we don't get this long drawn out. Sometimes in musicals and animated musicals, you'll get a full 3-minute, 5-minute set piece with something, and some of the times here, the songs don't overstay their welcome. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates, is like 30 seconds maybe.
Yeah, I was amazed at how fast that stuff flew by. Like the whole opening and the Shire, It's like 5 minutes and they're on the road.
I think as a kid, like you said, seeing this for the first time, not knowing anything about the world, it could leave you wanting more, where you're like, I really want to live more in this world.
Well, it's one of the reasons maybe why I wanted to keep rewatching it, because then I could like see those early scenes more. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I also just want to say, like, I you know what, I'm going to defend this movie some. I still have nostalgia for it, but feel free to lay into it if there are things you hated about it.
That song,
feelings, go for it.
That song definitely bothered me so far. I don't really think that there was a ton that I hated. The pacing was, as an adult, bothered me a little bit, because I'm like, what a magical world to want to live in more and see more of. There are a few things like throughout that are weird decisions that I'll touch on as we go. For example, the wood elves. Why are they designed like that?
I don't know. It feels somehow wrong. I don't know. It feels like it's appropriating some sort of culture. I wasn't sure which one, but
I wasn't even, maybe, but more so for me, like, that doesn't fit what I think of when I think of wood elves based on Tolkien's text as well.
They made them a lot more almost monstrous. Very, very different than than Elrond, right? Who's literally got stars floating around his head. Which, by the way, when I saw original Elrond in The Fellowship, this was the Elrond I was comparing him to. And I remember remember I said I didn't really love that performance of Elrond?
Yeah.
I think it's one of the reasons why, because this is very different than what we get in Fellowship.
He's like more serious in Fellowship, and seemingly like honestly though, this goes along with the text, because in the Hobbit text that we read, the elves are more like lighthearted and there's like less self-serious, whereas I feel like in the films, especially like Fellowship, all the elves that we meet are like very like mysterious and dark, and almost like seem like they could be antagonists at times.
Yeah, there's like a playfulness to the elves in the books that we don't get as much, because I'm remembering, like, I mean, think about the adaptation we just covered. Like, we're seeing the elves sort of being like, oh my god, I can't believe we have these dwarves here, like making a ruckus and singing all these raunchy songs and throwing food around. But like, the elves literally are like following the dwarves and like singing little playful songs about them and making fun of their beards, and like, they're so much more playful in the book.
Yeah, and there's less, the animosity between the two races isn't really there as much either, I feel.
Yeah, I think it was kind of played up by Peter Jackson.
Although I don't know that it's definitely in the text. I just mean in this kid's film, it's clear that it kind of blows by. There's not a huge emphasis made on it. You know, even like I noticed that the Arkenstone whole situation was taken out, which added that complexity that we liked in the novel.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot that was omitted that I didn't know at the time, but yeah, clearly now that we've studied this story so much, I'm like, oh, they're cutting this whole piece and this whole thing and that whole storyline. His father, Thorin's father, is just the king under the mountain. That's his name, apparently, in the movie, which makes no sense. Or it's not the king, it's King Under the Mountain. That's his father's name. I'm like, wait a minute. But then they call him King Under the Mountain at one point, so it was like they're trying to have it both ways, where it was both a title and the name of his father. Like, they desperately didn't want to introduce another dwarf name, I feel like.
I noticed that there wasn't a mandate to have any of them seem like they fucked. Obviously,
that's true.
in this Hobbit film, just as a callback to our.
In general, that's one of the things I've always felt that Rankin Bass characters always look kind of weird, and they certainly do here. One of the things I did not remember was how much, like, the dwarves in general in this version are pretty cowardly, and Bilbo is also kind of like, I don't know, he's kind of a shithead. I don't know, like, a lot of the characters weren't as likable. And Gandalf is like so, he's very serious, and like he knows everything, like he knows everything. But then he's also kind of a jerk.
He's quick to anger. Like, he'll yell at somebody. Yeah.
It's like, how dare you? And he's just like, and then he's like, you're going to leave a record for me so I can judge what you've done and tell you where you were wrong. Like, he's very serious and imposing and kind of like a professor, like in the way Tolkien was, I guess. Whereas, you know, comparing that to Ian McKellen, who's so friendly and warm, it's a very different style of Gandalf.
And he has moments where he does like the, you know, do not take me for a conjurer of cheap tricks kind of thing, where he like goes shadowy and seems powerful, but it's not like, that's not his number one sort of base like mood. I did notice too that they did play up that cowardly versus bravery thing throughout, because there's that even near the end, just to jump way ahead, Thorin calls Bilbo like a coward, and that's like the thing that sort of like fractures their relationship, whereas obviously there's a lot more to it in the novel. And that whole thing about this being early, I mean, like, you know, 70s fantasy, animated fantasy, and sort of the roots of what a typical and like status quo fantasy story would be is sort of that bravery, good versus evil, simplifying it down to sort of
they really boiled it down, and I think that the reason the dwarves are not as brave or likable in this version is just so that like the viewer has no choice but to sort of imprint on Bilbo. Bilbo is the main character. He's the one we care about. Everybody else is just kind of there to serve his plot. And sure enough, you know, the dwarves just repeatedly push him out into danger and don't seem to care, and themselves are like afraid all the time. They don't have like any badass moments really in the whole story, which I was kind of shocked to see. I'm like, man, the dwarves really aren't that likable. And yeah, even Thorin doesn't seem like some cool king like we get in the movies. Like, so I didn't love that in this new watch, but like, it doesn't change the fact of how important this was to me as a kid and how much I liked it at the time.
Let's talk about some of the good things that stand out to me.
Yeah.
For one, Smaug. I think this version of Smaug is like one of my favorite parts.
I love Smaug in this.
Yeah. Really cool.
So I looked it up, and it was voiced by Richard Boone, which I didn't know a lot of the movies he'd been in. It looks like he wasn't like the lead in a lot of them, but he was in some movies I'd heard of. Like, I think he was in The Maltese Falcon. And a bunch of westerns. He appeared. He like was alongside like John Wayne and people like that. So he was that kind of actor who's in those kinds of movies, and he just has this great gravelly, imposing voice that, man, I think works so well for Smaug. Like, he is, I don't know. Yeah, tell me about what you liked about Smaug here, because I agree.
I love cat dragon design.
Very unusual, right? Like, not what you expect. He's got fur around his face.
Yeah. There's the moment where he's sort of seeking, and he has these like spotlight eyes. Yeah.
Spotlight eyes, they like scared me. So that's the other thing I gotta touch on, is how much like this is a weirdly dark movie at times, right? For like someone who's my age watching it, you could see why. Like, I think one of the things I loved about it compared to, because the other movies I was watching at this time was probably like animated Disney films, like 101 Dalmatians. Like, when I say that, I'm not talking about the live action. I'm talking about the original animated 101, and like Bambi, and you know, like really the old animated stuff. You know, Snow White. Those were the kind of ones I was watching, and those all generally a lot lighter. Like, there's just a Disney, they had figured out a tone, they had figured out how they were going to appeal. They might have a moment of like tragedy early on, that kind of thing, like in Bambi, obviously there is. But like overall, they made a freaking billion-dollar empire, multi-billion-dollar empire based off of like nailing these movies, and that's kind of the foundation for me of what did that. And this is not like that. This is a children animation that like had no qualms having bizarre goblins with two throats, and having this dark golem creature that is in this like bleak cave and talking about eating people, and there's just a lot of weird darkness and creepiness in this movie, and that super appealed to young Luke. And I think about how I also fell in love with horror as a kid, and I was reading Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark at a very young age. But one of the things I think that kept drawing me back to this was it both fascinated me as like a fantasy fan, or a young fantasy fan, but also was frightening. And there was a thrill to like Gollum in particular. I remember that whole scene was terrifying to me, yet I loved watching it. And that's like an early story I can go to of me being scared of something yet seeking it out.
Yeah. I was looking for that when I was young as well. Like, animation just happens to be, people saw it as for kids. So for a long time there was a lot of that. And some of the avenues that I started to find as I got a little bit older was anime being entirely different from what you're looking at with like your Disney and the things they're going to hit the bullet points.
But like
they're going to hit
early 90s when I was watching this, or even just like late 80s, there wasn't much of that at all.
Well, anime, there was a lot of anime.
But I mean, I didn't have access to it. Like, it was only what was on TV. They weren't playing that on TV usually. You'd have to like know where to get it.
Yeah, I remember my journey through anime too was sort of like VHSs that people would pass around and stuff like that. And this is,
but I mean, even
this
that
is
would have been like 10 years later, that's a lot different.
Right. And then, you get your Toonami, obviously, in the like 90s and 2000s as well, which is giving you some of that. But yeah, I think a lot of Americans clicked into that because we wanted something that wasn't this Disneyfication of animation and things like that. So anytime that there's a couple movies that I can remember from growing up, like Quest for Camelot. I don't know if you ever saw that, but that's
I have to Google that one, maybe.
Yeah, that's one I don't believe that's Disney, but it's sort of weird and fantasy, and I like some of the designs look very different than Disney. And then you get things like Anastasia, and then there's just other animation studios.
I don't think I've seen this one. There was some movies, like I'm remembering I had on this VHS, I think that The Hobbit was on. There were other animated shows that were fantasy shows that had been recorded, and there was one called like the Railway Dragon that we may have talked about in another episode. There was what's the name, Puff the Magic Dragon.
Oh yeah, definitely.
There was like a very old animation of Puff the Magic. So I think all of these were like on one tape for me, so I'd watch the entire tape and see them all in a row. It was very cool, and very different. Like a lot of those are just really unusual movies. Like I go back and watch, like I went and watched the Railway Dragon, I think, because it's pretty short, and I was like, this is a weird freaking story.
Yeah. And so I think it's cool that you found a way into like a different style, not Disney animation, and like clicked in and felt the tonally that it was probably different, and that like style wise, even as a kid, you were picking up on that. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to like with this film. Like you said, the Gollum stuff really stands out to me. The goblins are crazy looking. Yeah, they're pretty scary in the way that they like grab everybody and drag them is definitely scary for a kid.
Absolutely, they're bizarre looking. I saw one thing I was reading was some of the critical reception to this movie, and one person said that the Rankin Bass Productions have now carefully translated The Hobbit into film. The result is a curiously eclectic but filled with nice, effective moments. The drawings frequently suggest strong resemblances to non-Tolkien characters. The goblins could have stepped out of a Maurice Sendak book, which I thought was interesting because we've covered Sendak before. And he says, but the dragon and Gollum, the riddle aficionado, brings some clever, original touches. Whatever its flaws, this television version of The Hobbit warrants attention. And it was actually up for a Hugo for Best Dramatic Presentation the year it came out, and it lost to Star Wars Episode 4.
Yeah, 77. I think that's probably pretty much every category.
That's pretty amazing. It was up against Star Wars for Hugo.
Yeah. I just thought of another animated film that I watched growing up that wasn't Disney that has some harrowing moments too, and it's Land Before Time. I don't know if you watched Land Before Time.
Oh yeah, I definitely will. I love that because I love dinosaurs, so I was all about that.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because like there's that, which is like pretty positive, and overall it looks like the reception over time has remained fairly positive. Mm-hmm. But then there was this Tolkien scholar who apparently hated it. Douglas Anderson said he called the adaptation execrable in his annotated Hobbit. And although he did not elaborate, he seems to think that the plot was confusing for those not already familiar. So I can see that being a potential criticism. Part of it for me is also like, you can have a visceral dislike of this animation style too. Something about the faces can be off-putting. I get it.
This animation style to me is very appealing, I think, especially for a Western audience. Like it feels like, the creatures obviously are always going to have like weird designs and things like that.
See, I think it's the faces of the people that can throw people. Like, looking at Bilbo, sometimes I just look at him and I'm like, I can see why someone might look at that and just think it looks bad.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I guess it's a certain style, right? Like very different. But you look at like a Gandalf and it kind of looks like as you would expect.
Yeah, Gandalf looks good, I think. Exactly what you would think a wizard would look like. Here's something interesting. I was just thinking about how... Now, this isn't really fair because this is comparing it to Lord of the Rings. But when this movie came out, it was approximately 22 years around after the Lord of the Rings was coming out. So that would be like now something that came out in the year 2000. That's how like close this was to the release of the Lord of the Rings. Now it's an adaptation of The Hobbit, I understand, but still, Lord of the Rings was what put it on the map, I think. So it was a pretty new, like relatively new thing, this book series at the time, whereas now we're looking at it as this like
ancient text.
Yeah, the ancient text, and it's like no, this was at the time it was still like little known probably in America at least.
And if you think about it in comparison to The Hobbit, it was the 30s. So it is, even for the 70s, late 70s, it was a long time, 40 years.
And I know it was starting to get popular. Like in the 70s, there was an explosion of popularity in the U.S. I remember that.
There's obviously a reason why this film ends with a sort of like Lord of the Rings teaser where like Gandalf knows about the ring and he's like, one day your descendants will...
It's interesting that Gandalf is sort of narrating this version too. Like he comes in first, voiced by John Huston, which I think that is actually might be the most well-known actor. And I think he's great. Like that's always going to be like a iconic Gandalf voice for me. Like it just sounds so wise and authoritative. Not as friendly, this version of Gandalf, but that's okay. I think still a good one.
Yeah. So I have to, since if we're talking about John Huston, I have to mention he, for one, is known for like Chinatown and like to talk about something crazy. Orson Welles' last film released in 2018. And it was this like unreleased film. There's a huge story behind it, so we can't get into all of it. But John Huston was in The Other Side of the Wind, which came out in 2018, and it was this big thing that like released on Netflix, and it was like Orson Welles' last film. It's this wild, like if you're interested in film history and Orson Welles and that kind of stuff, look into the documentary and also the film that are both on Netflix. It's crazy that this film got released 40 years later or whatever, maybe more.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's our Gandalf apparently.
Yeah, and I think he's great as it. We introduced the dwarves. They're already singing their song as they're showing up, and then they come inside, and I love the moment where they're singing the Misty Mountain song, the Dungeons Deep song, and we see their shadows on the wall. And I was just thinking about how clever... There's like so many clever moments like that in this version compared to the Return of the King that we got later, and we both thought was pretty bad. And so you could see why I was kind of comparing the two. I think this one's like head and shoulders above what we got in Return of the King later.
I think that's definitely true, and I think the animation's more consistent in this film. Like
it works better for this tone. I think this like whimsical, childlike tone, full of songs. Whereas Return of the King, like the songs always felt like they didn't fit. And I think there was less songs, which it seems good, but also is kind of bad because I think this works better as almost a musical.
Yeah, as it goes along. It's more what people and like kids watching animation are accustomed to as well. Emphasis on the ring, I think, is interesting to track in different adaptations and different like iterations of The Hobbit, because the ring here is given, again, like more weight in a weird way. It's not like this all-powerful weight because we haven't really... I don't think they knew what they wanted to do with an eventual adaptation of the Lord of the Rings yet.
I had no idea.
But they knew it was an important artifact or whatever, and then so Bilbo's wearing it kind of willy-nilly and like showing it. I think Gandalf knows it like right away. He's like,
has
he knows
the ring of truth. Yes, it rings true. Like,
he like brings home treasure. I think that's what it is at the end. And he's like, and you've retained another treasure as well or something. And he's like, oh yeah.
He seems to really know about the ring, which like Gandalf shouldn't completely know about it at this point. But yeah, they're just trying to like pave the way for this to maybe be a thing they'll get to do again. I think at some point, seems like they were kind of hoping they'd get to make the whole trilogy.
Yeah. So I don't know about you, but since we just watched Unexpected Journey for the main feed, I was like going beyond that portion of the story was fun for me. I was like, oh, okay, we're getting something that I haven't, I read recently but haven't seen in a long time.
It'll be interesting to compare, or at least have it in our minds.
Yeah, the Eagles come and save them in the same way, sort of at when they leave, and then we go into like all the Mirkwood stuff where Gandalf conveniently is like, all right, keep a record, but you're on your own now. Yeah, that brings up the scene that you mentioned in our book coverage with the butterflies that like kind of stood out to you above the trees.
I remember that. I thought it was more colorful. I don't know if the color was translating the right way and what version I'm watching, but I remember the butterflies being like purple, and like these were really dark.
Yeah, they were like
the version I was watching.
Gray, I think.
Yeah, but like in general, I felt like my memory of this animation was more colorful. So I'm wondering if something happened with the versions and the getting put on different formats and the DVD release, and
someone cranked the saturation on your VCR before they recorded,
well,
maybe.
That's definitely possible. I mean, if that's even something you can do on a VCR, I don't know.
Yeah, I know. I mean, like I would assume that however you set your TV settings, it would record similarly.
I mean, my TV was pretty bare bones back in the day.
Yeah,
I don't know.
You could definitely affect like the saturation and tint and stuff, I'm sure.
Yeah, maybe. But anyway, yeah, it's just interesting how it definitely looked kind of different. Overall, honestly, there was stuff that color-wise felt a little off, but it was fine, and it had the same effect.
So, I guess not to gloss over the Gollum stuff. Gollum, interesting design, not anything I've ever imagined.
Kind of frog-like was
Very
the
frog-like.
most way I was, but like, so this was scary to me. I always that was one of my initial reactions to seeing Gollum in Fellowship. Is Gollum did not seem frightening to me in the way that this Gollum did, especially when Gollum gets really angry in this one when he starts screaming about the thief. I remember that scared the shit out of me as a kid. And like, you know, we see his teeth and we see he's kind of big, especially compared to Bilbo. It looks like he could totally eat him. And the version that we get in the Fellowship always felt kind of cute to me. And at times they try and play him up as being kind of scary, but there is a cuteness to that character.
I think he's like creepy, and then there's like this obviously this floating ambiguity of like, is he going to be good or bad?
Right. And I get why they do that, and I think it does work. It's my version of Gollum was always much more frightening and scary because of this.
I think the reaction I always get from the Fellowship Gollum, because this is like early, we don't get like full evil Gollum at that point. It's kind of like switching back and forth, Smeagol and Gollum kind of thing. And I remember just always feeling like he needed to be quiet because he's going to alert everyone to Sam and Frodo's position and everything like that. So I guess also just to correct ourselves right now, Gollum's not really in Fellowship. He's more in Two Towers.
Oh,
He's
is that? Oh, you're right. Yeah, sorry. There's like a brief mention of him, right? They see him following.
He's lurking and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
but
you're right. Two Towers is where he shows up and sits.
But regardless, he's always like signaling.
Those movies kind of run together for me in a good way because it's just kind of like one long movie.
Yeah, and he's always like screaming and signaling their positions and stuff. So it's always more about like the danger of him revealing where they are versus him actually being a threat. So I can see where you're coming from.
Yeah. So a couple other notes I had. One, I think this movie helped instill a love of the mountains and the forests in me, and from a young age, because of how different that was than what I was seeing in Florida. Like I'd go outside and it's flat swamp area, basically with like some beaches. That's Florida. And, some people absolutely love it. There are things to like there. I, in general, have always felt like I was being called to the mountains and to like great forests and stuff like that. And I think this movie's part of it, right? Like the wanderlust that we see in Bilbo as he wants to explore, I think that instilled on me and imprinted on me at a young age. And honestly, this movie might at least have like a few percentage points of the reason that I now live in Oregon might come back to this movie.
That's funny to think about. That's cool.
I was thinking about that. And then, the other thing in very different note, but the other thing I was thinking about was how with Bilbo, I couldn't believe how cavalier and stuff he was being at different times in this movie, like taking the ring off just so he could like show himself to people. Like he does it to Smaug and it's like really, really over the top. But like, I think even with Gollum, he's like, ta-ta, like he does these like little things where he's like taunting the monsters a little bit, and then like with Smaug, I can't believe he like pulls it off and he like reveals himself and he's like, here I am and here's what I stole, and then Smaug blows fire at him and almost roasts him. And it's like, I guess it's kind of fun for like a kid because it makes it seem like it can't be that dangerous if he's not that scared, I guess. But logically, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and it makes him seem, I don't know, foolhardy, I guess, to put it mildly, in a way that the character really isn't in the book.
I can see that, and it's sort of that, I think, playing up that for kids, right? They're like, oh boy, he could get caught. He could, he's.
But it's like, look how what kind of a mood he's in. He's being playful, so he can't be that. He's not in that much danger.
There's some cool animation moments that I really liked with like the ways that they represent the invisibility, and sometimes he'll be like slightly visible and then he'll go full invisible, and then the things that they do with Sting and the way that it
that
flows,
was interesting.
And they do like these weird like flashing effects when he's like using it, and it's like sending off magic almost, it seems like, when he's fighting the spiders.
Yeah, he does like a circle around the spiders, circles them up with Sting, and I thought it was interesting how like whenever he stabs something, instead of seeing like a stab, we just get like a spinning image.
Oh yeah. Oh, that was a moment of me being like, this is how you cut corners, right? To like, this is, you signal in the language of cinema, like, all right, something's dead now, but you're not going to show it like physically get cut in half and fall over.
Yeah.
And all
and it's like, this is clearly being designed for young children, and it's going to play
also
on TV. So I'm sure they had lots of censorship issues they had to get past to even be able to appear
the last third of the film really is just Smaug and the interaction with Smaug, and then we get the very short Battle of Five Armies stuff,
flies
which is
by.
how it should be, and it flies by, and it works, and you still get all five armies, and you see them clashing, and Bilbo does. I think he kind of just goes to sleep in this version rather than getting knocked out. He kind of lays down.
He just kind of sits there and watches. I think. I don't even know if he gets knocked out. I think he just puts on his ring at one point. He's like, all right, I'm done. And he just watches the rest of the battle play out. Yeah, maybe he does take a nap or something and wake up. I think you might be right.
Maybe anti-war in the late 70s, something like a messaging of like,
well,
you know.
It was interesting because the whole thing was played for a joke in the sense that like these armies were all at each other's throats, and then the goblins are coming, and then they turn to each other and they're very over the top. They're like, my brother, we have always seen eye to eye, and we have always had each other's back. Let us fight together again. You know, like and he's like, the dwarf's like, yes, you are totally right. Dwarves and elves have always been as friends, and like, it completely goes over what happened, and then Bilbo kind of looks at the camera and is like, I guess I don't understand war. And yeah, I do think there was like, it was kind of played as a joke, kind of saying something about war in general. But it was very lighthearted, and the way they came together was kind of viewed as almost silly to fight against a common foe. It played okay for a kid because I remember even then, like, this was one of my least favorite parts of the movie because, like, I don't know, it almost was like too adult. It was like it's so much simpler to think about like a monster, like a dragon or like a golem, versus like a bunch of armies, you know, trying to figure out if they can get the loot, and I wasn't like ready for that as a kid, so I remember like this was a part I was always kind of checked out on. But you know, it's interesting as an adult coming back to it because like this part is actually pretty interesting from, you know, like a serious perspective.
So I, being the like animation nerd that I am, and I just love this kind of stuff, I, after the film, was like, man, I bet you can buy individual animation cells that were used for this film. And I think about that a lot with like physically made, like practically made animated films like these from like, I would say like the 90s and before. And you can buy them. I found them online.
Yeah.
So you can buy, there's like one shot where I think Bilbo's like, or maybe this is, I was also seeing some of the Return of the King and Fellowship and some of the Lord of the Rings cells as well, but you're looking at like $1,000+ per like one cell. But
I guess that makes sense.
I always thought it's so cool though to like, that's something that like if I ever got insanely rich and I just had all the money in the world, I would definitely buy up animation cells for my favorite. Like I saw one for Akira, and it was
how
like,
big are they?
Not very big. There's just a page, because what they do a lot of the times is they hand draw it on a piece of paper, and then they take a cell, put it over top of it, and trace what they've already drawn, and then color it and everything, and then they have the cell, and then they throw it on there, and they move things around in the frames, and like, you know, just to have one of those, to me, it always feels like it would be like owning a piece of not that I feel the need to own things, like there's this weird ownership thing.
It'd be a cool showpiece. Yeah.
I something about like cinematic history and preserving that, and just have it like displayed somewhere. And I was thinking like how cool I think Smaug looks like.
Exactly. I was thinking if I was going to have one, I'm like, what would I have? Probably Smaug. Maybe Gollum. I also like Gollum's design here because it's pretty unusual. It's very different than what we see in the Peter Jackson films. But, you know, I have some nostalgia for it.
So, and what's crazy is like you can get like a really small one that's just like Smaug that's just like Gollum being manipulated in the frames and stuff like that. You can get like the backgrounds are the ones that are really expensive, and then you can get smaller ones that are just like individual characters and stuff. So
I was seeing some interesting stuff in the production that I feel like we should touch on. For one, it seems like there was some sort of dispute about this being public domain. Like they claimed that it was public domain. And it seems like the Tolkien estate was like, combative about that. There was some sort of legal battle. I didn't see a lot of details, but it seems like they made this movie and claimed it was public domain. And the Tolkien estate, I assume, did not love that. And I'm wondering if that has been an ongoing thing with like this movie and its existence period.
I think it's clear that the rights have always been. They have not been handled as well as they could have been across the board with the Tolkien estate. And I think that that's something that's kind of, it's the reason why it hasn't been expanded on, even though like his son has carried it on in some ways.
Yeah, Christopher Tolkien's now passed away too, though. It's now, I think, on to grandchildren at this point, I believe. I'm not sure about that, by the way, but I think that's what it is. I'm not 100% up on that.
So they continue to like create more and continue his legacy and use his manuscripts and just like keep fleshing out the world. They hold on to the rights very closely, but then they also don't sanction some adaptations and then do other ones, and they have to be like directly involved with a certain amount of control. So
They're very controlling with it, it seems like, and I don't know, maybe they got burned here. Maybe this is one of the reasons why.
that might
Because
be.
apparently this got made and they weren't happy about it from the little bit I was seeing.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know much about that. That's cool.
And I could see being frustrated if you're not getting any sort of, like, they didn't actually pay to get these rights or anything. That would
No,
be
yeah, that would
frustrating.
be messed up, obviously, for sure. I wanted to talk about the fact that in my research I saw that this is the second version of The Hobbit that was animated.
Really? Okay, I didn't know that.
The original was a 1966 12-minute animated short by Gene
12
Deitch.
minutes for the entire movie?
Yeah. It was considerably different from the source material, though,
Oh, okay.
taking place in a city called Dale, which had an Arkenstone of magic, a princess, and a dragon called Slag, as opposed to Smog. None of this was in Tolkien's book at all, and this 1966 cartoon was quickly forgotten about, although it can still be viewed online on YouTube. So.
Oh, interesting. I have to check that out. Yeah, man. That I guess we can wrap this up here. But I just want to know, now that we've talked it through, your the music, the animation style, the performances. But like ultimately, like, it's got the songs. It's got like almost all the songs are given here. It's got mostly the same plot. How did you feel about this adaptation as an adaptation of The Hobbit? Even if, like, I guess, like, separate from the quality as a standalone film, like, as an adaptation, how did it play for you?
Yeah. I think as a kid, this would have hit me perfectly like it did you. I think I really would have enjoyed it. I did enjoy it. I think that it's cool, especially being a Tolkien fan and being someone who's kind of, I think, consumed most of the things that exist, other than some of the books and the Silmarillion.
At this point, man, like, we've done almost all of it. Like,
Yeah,
think,
I mean, honestly, the Rings of Power has been getting me more interested in.
Yeah, because that's something that's actually kind of new. Yeah,
Yeah, but
me.
it's also getting me interested in, like, checking into the Silmarillion, which is something that I always kind of felt was too intimidating and haven't checked
agreed.
into a lot.
Well, also, like, I just didn't have the interest. I'm like, it's reportedly so dense, and it's getting into all this lore that, like, is cool, but I don't know that I need to devote all this time to. Whereas now I have a reason to, because it gives more context to the Rings of Power show, which I am enjoying for the most part. That's a whole separate conversation.
Yeah, different conversation. I'm enjoying it with some I have thoughts, but we'll talk about it another time. I think this film existing is awesome. I think if you're a Tolkien fan, you should definitely check it out to have the context of all of that. And it was probably very influential if we really wanted to pick through it in terms of all the Lord of the Rings stuff that came after.
I think this influenced Peter Jackson's film too.
I believe it,
and not just obviously his Hobbit films, but like even his design for a lot of what came in Lord of the Rings. The way, of course, a lot of it comes from the book, but like he looked at all the adaptations that were existing at the time when he made his stuff.
Yeah,
and,
for sure. I think if you're not a huge Tolkien fan, I'm not going to like go out of my way to recommend this to like everybody watch. But I think if you are interested enough, absolutely, it's a short watch and like it's enjoyable. You can put yourself in the shoes. Maybe if you watch it with a child, if you had a child, I think a child would get a lot out of it, and you could sort of live vicariously through them as well.
It is tough because I feel like children today are probably going to be kind of jaded about the way it looks because they're so used to modern adaptation. Just looks so different now.
It just depends on how much you expose them to early on. I think that's always going to be a big thing. Like people push people. I think a lot of people nowadays find it tough to watch black and white films, and it's wild to think about because so many grew up on that and like lived that. And like there's so much worth it checking out, and I think as long as you're exposed to it early enough and you're like find enjoyment out of it, you will hold on to that for your life.
So for me, I have such a fond spot for this movie, such nostalgia about it, and it still works in that sense, and it reminds me of watching it as a kid. But admittedly, I didn't find it nearly as enthralling as an adult watching it. I think it's interesting as a fan of Lord of the Rings in general, and as by comparison as an adaptation, to see one that blows through this story in an hour 15 as opposed to how long it's getting drawn out in the other versions we're watching. So it's cool, but admittedly, no, this isn't necessarily the greatest thing, and I'm not going to tell everybody they need to watch it. It's always going to have a special place for me, but beyond that, no, this isn't like a great movie that everyone needs to watch. It's aimed at a very young audience, and I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like it's really dated in a lot of ways, and it's just not going to work for a lot of people because of that, and it's going to come down to like, I feel like personal taste and what we've come to expect from animated movies now has just changed so much.
Yeah, but do you think Tolkien fans would like it? Do you think?
I think I think it's of interest for Tolkien fans. And if you've never seen it, especially if you're curious what a version of The Hobbit looks like that gets through the plot in an hour 15, it's a cool example of that. It has all the songs in there, and I think a lot of them are pretty catchy. Like the Goblin song's cool. Like there's a song about the birds, the funny little birds, they're up in the trees, in the fir trees, and there's all these fun little songs. Like the elves are singing about the dwarves. Like a lot of the songs that I forgot were in the book until I heard them again in this version. I'm like, oh yeah, that is right out of the book. It's cool to hear that. And it gives me this hope and dream of like what could have been if we'd gotten that fairy tale version we talked about from Guillermo del Toro. And it would have been like, that's my dream, right? Is that it would have been more akin to this, yet through his eyes, little like longer, obviously, and more bizarre and like aged up, but still have this sort of like fairy tale feel, which I think this adaptation actually does pretty well. Is it feels like you're listening to a fairy tale, and man, that's exciting, and that's like something I just will always wish. I would even just love to hear like the storyboards. Like, tell me what it would have looked like in his mind. I just want to talk to the man off the record. Just talk to me. I want to hear.
Part of me feels like it would cut too deep if I did know. Like I would just like, I don't think I want to know. I just think I'm just bummed that it doesn't exist.
Hey, and maybe one day we will get it, because I don't know how, I should know more about how the law works, but I know that public domain is a thing. I know that there are ways to get around it. And we got a couple of big projects that are coming up against it. I know Disney's fighting against it for a lot of their properties.
I was gonna say, as long as Disney wants to retain the mouse, and make sure that copyright doesn't sort of lapse, they'll keep moving the goalposts. And anybody basically who falls within that same time threshold will probably be able to retain their rights just based on their.
But like we just saw Winnie the Pooh come into public domain, and all of a sudden immediately we get this like horror Winnie the Pooh drops, right?
Yeah, that is true. Yeah,
and it's like if this actually can pass into public domain at some point, and I wonder if that'll open the floodgates and we'll start seeing. Show me some more animated adaptations of The Lord of the Rings. Show me an animated Hobbit adaptation. That could be really cool with a modern animation studio come in and take it seriously.
Something that I've always wanted in the same vein is I think that a world that is so ripe for animation and an animated show or movie or whatever is George R. R. Martin's Song of Fire. Can you imagine that?
Yeah, that would be really cool.
It would be so cool.
That's honestly, I think, the best way to revisit, the later seasons that had trouble. But I wait until the books are out. Fingers crossed. We're getting distracted.
Cyberpunk, just as an aside, Cyberpunk, the game didn't do super well. It's sort of people are playing around on it because they've kind of updated and done things with it. And this anime is now out. And I haven't watched all of it yet. I watched like one episode, and everybody's telling me it's amazing. So I'm going to finish it.
I haven't seen any of it. That's cool.
Yeah, and it's cool to see like different properties. Like still, you think of Arcane, obviously, with a game that made it a show. And like a lot of these, I think that there's going to be a lot of cool IP that like uses animation as a medium to get like amazing stories out there.
I hope so, man. I hope I think we're already in the midst of sort of a golden age of adaptations.
Yeah.
Dare I say.
Love, Death, and Robots. You just sent me one about a horror one as well.
Speaking of Guillermo del Toro, it's his Cabinet of Curiosities, and it's an adaptation of a bunch of different horror short stories.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yes, keep this thing going. I think it's live action.
Oh, okay.
But still, like, I love the idea of these little anthology series. It's not an interconnected story. It's a bunch of little mini stories. Like, yeah, adapting short stories is so cool. And like we've talked about how they often lend themselves really well to an adaptation because they give you a lot of space as a creator, yet they give you that cool basis to work from. Anyway, we're going over time now. So until next time,
keep adapting.